Cubans have cast their ballots for a new parliament, the National Assembly of People's Power. Raul Castro is one of the candidates, but he plans to step down as president as the new assembly meets for the very first time next month. Cuba's political leadership is about to go through a major generational change.
More than 8 million Cubans are expected to vote in Sunday's elections. There are two separate ballots, one for the provincial deputies, the other for the National Assembly. Of the 605 parliamentary seats being contested, there's only one pre-selected candidate for each seat. Nevertheless, there is a real sense of anticipation. When the new National Assembly meets on April the 19th, it will select a new president. Raul Castro has announced he's stepping down. The man seen here beside him, 57-year-old First Vice President Miguel Díaz-Canel, is expected to take over. Castro will stay on, though, as head of the Communist Party. The makeup of the new National Assembly will also mark a generational change. According to the official newspaper Granma, 90% of the candidates were born after the revolution. The average age is 49, and the majority are first-time candidates.
I think these changes are good. They will help improve our system while at the same time supporting our revolution and all our achievements. These we will never renounce.
We as the younger generation must help and be a part of the work developed since the 1959 revolution till now.
Whoever becomes the next president faces major challenges. Cuba's economy is struggling, state wages are low, and it can no longer rely on aid from its crisis-hit ally Venezuela. How the new administration responds is something many will be watching.
Cuba's general elections, a political crossroads certainly facing the country, but what exactly is next? Let's turn to our panel. In Shanghai, we are joined by satellite Jiang Shixue, a professor and director of the Center for Latin American Studies of Shanghai University. Welcome, Professor. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., Luis Carlos Batista, who is a Cuban lawyer affiliated with the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program at Inter-America Dialogue. We hope later in our program we are going to also have someone coming from Cuba joining us in the conversation. Let me begin with you, Professor Batista. Ask you about what exactly is going on in Cuba. What do you think this generational change will eventually mean?
So actually, it will be a new challenge for the new president, and obviously the biological life of Fidel Castro first and Raul Castro, it has taken a toll in them, and the whole generation of people and revolutionaries that they went to the Sierra Maestra. It's something that the Cuban people need. They need new energy, and they need new people in front of the party and the state, and the Cuban state.
And I'm glad to be joined now also by Carlos Zuccarelli, former Cuban ambassador to Brussels and a professor of international relations at the University of Havana. He is joining us in Cuba. It's great to have you, Professor, once again on our program. What do you think? Good that you're having your glasses right now. Yes. What do you think this generational change would mean for Cuban politics?
Well, it is important to take into place that this generation that is taking over is a generation that is very well educated. It's a generation that got into education at one of the high points of the Cuban educational system. So they are highly prepared. Many of them have a lot of political experience over the years inside the Cuban system. Nevertheless, there are two things that have to be taken into account. One, they have been a generation that was born and raised under the American embargo, so they don't have a very good opinion about the United States, and that is a problem that they will have to face. They are inheriting the leadership at a moment when the U.S. Under Trump is more aggressive against Cuba than before. And finally, there is the issue of socialism. Their perception of socialism is very much marked by the socialism that worked in the 70s and 80s. That socialism is gone. So socialism has to be rethought as the principal model. But they have the documents. There are 3 or 4 documents that have been approved in the last Congress of the Cuban Communist Party, in the National Assembly, that more or less set the stage for the process. One final point.
Okay.
Institutions. Under Raul Castro, the usual institutions that handle government have been reestablished. So that is also a plus.
All right. Mr. Jiang, Professor Jiang, coming from Shanghai, you've been researching about the country of Cuba for a long time. So let me go to you as well. When we talk about this transition, we seem to have already some foundations for transition in Cuba, as Professor Ambassador just mentioned. One is several important documents that has already been adopted by the Cuban Communist Party and also the country, the parliament. Secondly, it is that Raul Castro, even though he's not going to be the president of the country anymore, he's going to stay as the general secretary of the Cuban Communist Party still. So he's going to oversee this transition process. So how much do you think the change that we are talking about here?
Well, I would say there should be some kind of changes, definitely, because we are going to see Diaz-Canel coming into power. But I don't believe that there should be dramatic changes, because Raul will maintain the position as the boss of the Communist Party of the Caribbean island. So we can say there should be changes, but there should be no dramatic changes. But anyway, I would say everybody within and outside of the Cuba are hoping that there should be some kind of transformation. The new president should maintain the momentum of pushing forward economic reforms. You know, the daunting task for the Caribbean island is to develop its economy. You know, I heard a joke about Cuba. There are 3 successes and 3 failures of the Cuban Revolution. The 3 successes are free education, free medical care, and the defense of their so-called sovereignty. These are 3 successes, but also there are 3 failures. That's breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So you know that we should hope that the new leader of Cuba should put more emphasis on promoting economic growth.
I see. Putting the joke aside, it does indicate an important problem or issue facing the country, Mr. Ambassador. That is the economy. There are several things, Mr. Ambassador, people are talking about. The dual currency system, the overall economic revival of the country, and how is Cuba going to deal with its neighbors, not to mention the United States, particularly the trade relations, let's just say, even though there is still an embargo. So having said all of this, where is the starting point? That is usually the most important thing, Mr. Ambassador.
Yes, you were talking to me, I'm sorry.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, well, I think it is important. What is happening in Cuba is that there is a design for the reform. That design includes the expansion of the private sector, the redesign of the state sector so that it becomes more efficient, more autonomous, and then there are other things that have to be done, like the unification of the currency, etc. Now, all these things are kind of in a pause right now, but they have to return. Reality will come and will hit very hard to the new leadership, and they'll have to do something about the current implementation of the economic reform. I don't think the problem is about the sign. The design is there, everybody knows what has to be done. The question is how to implement it. Now, Raul Castro has complained in the past about the old mentality, that there is too much weight of the old mentality, and I think he's right in that we have to work on an old view of things and be more realistic about market and market economics.
Okay, Mr. Batista, though. Market and market economy, those sounds like attractive words. And China, reform opening up, it does prosper. But, you know, talking about it and really doing it, and doing it even under embargo are very different things. And Mr. Batista, where is it? How fast can it do? Cuba.
So, obviously, with a new government, they will try to establish some kind of relationship with the U.S. So to improve those relationships. I don't think that here in the United States, the status quo of President Trump or the administration of President Trump, they will see a new government differently than they see it with Raul Castro. But obviously, you know, Díaz-Canel, he will be a president for the 21st century. So he will have to deliver results of the 21st century for the 21st century Cuban population. And that means improving the economy. As Ambassador Alzugaray said, unifying the two currencies that is a huge problem for the Cuban economy. So, and people are already requesting those issues. So to improve the Cuban economy, Díaz-Canel cannot keep the same rhetoric of the Raul Castro and Fidel Castro, keeping their moral authority based on what they did in Sierra Maestra and what they have done throughout all these years. So obviously he will have to take new challenges and to deliver new results to establish a new moral authority.
But Mr. Batista, I have to ask you that question since you talk about two issues. One is about the economic reform that the new president coming in could do, while at the same time respecting the previous set of rhetorics and ideologies. But as you may know, Mr. Batista, any kinds of reform, you need to take steps more than just the policy itself. You have to deal with real people, you deal with real issues, deal with the interest groups and special interests all at the same time. That's true for any country. So when you have a previous set of ideologies, how can you move ahead with the current set of policies, which certainly would upset some people in the country? Cuba, for example, this time. So, Mr. Batista.
Obviously, he will have to move. I don't think he will basically move ahead during this first year or 2 years in a different way that Raul Castro would have done. And he will have to negotiate with more orthodox people inside the party and with more moderate people inside the party. So he will have to negotiate between those two main groups, but at the same time deliver new results for the Cuban people. So I don't think his task will be very easy, especially within the main 2 years. And let's see. I mean, he will have to set a moral authority again.
Okay, Ambassador Alzugaray, I have to go to you now, Ambassador, because the outside could look at the country in a totally different lens compared to exactly the chemistry that is going on within a country, particularly when it comes to politics and when it comes to countries of politics that have been closed to mainly the outside world. Mr. Ambassador, what is your feeling when you are feeling the pulse of Cuba?
Well, I think Cuba has to adapt to the reality, and I find that probably we are having difficulty with adapting to the reality of the world. We cannot see the world in black and white. It has different shades of gray. So, and one important factor, and this is where reality comes in, Cuba doesn't have the capacity to have an autarkic economy. Cuba depends on the rest of the world. And one important factor in the future, one of the most important factors of the Cuban economy is going to be tourism. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that in order to develop, we will have to develop a tourist industry that is projected to the outside world. So a lot of things have to come in. I like something that I think I heard from Deng Xiaoping in terms of you open the windows, some flies are going to come in, but you have to open the windows. So there is probably the process that we are facing.
Uh-huh. What about that quote coming from Deng Xiaoping? Professor Jiang, I'm sure you growing up in the period of reform opening up, very familiar with it. Having said that, though, we have to ask that question. That is, whether this generation of leader is going to be very different from the earlier generation, particularly when you think about Cuba, 1959. Since then, it's all Castro that is really sitting in the office. And now it's a name change. Whether a name change means a game change, that is the question. Professor Jiang.
Well, if you look at the so-called Chinese model, yeah, if you just look at the so-called Chinese model, we can see that in order to push forward economic reforms, you need to have two things. One is the so-called mind mentality. The second is tangible actions. Now, the Cuban leadership does not have the so-called liberal mind. I would say until now, the Cuban Communist Party and the government still believe that market is a devil. Globalization is a devil. Now look at China. Here in China, market is playing a decisive role. But in Cuba, market is considered as a devil. So if you have this kind of mentality, how can you push forward economic reforms?
All right.
How can you take up tangible actions to push forward the so-called economic reforms?
All right.
So I would say the new Cuban leadership should have a liberal mind.
Okay. Mr. Ambassador, what about your response?
Yes. Well, I think they will have to adapt. It's true that there are many things that come from the past that are important to keep in mind, like independence from the United States, an active role of Cuba in international affairs, the spirit of fairness in our society, on education, health. Those things are important, and it's true that you have to keep them in place. And these are things that we owe to Fidel Castro and Raul Castro. But you have to realize that in order to keep that, in order to keep real political independence, real social justice, you have to become economically progressive, prosperous, and, well, the party has defined it, a prosperous and sustainable economy. We have to produce that. We don't have that yet. And, of course, that requires that we adapt to the reality. That's tough. It's not easy because, as I said, this generation grew in a socialism that apparently worked. But it apparently worked because it was subsidized by the Soviet Union.
I see.
That kind of socialism will never exist in Cuba again. We will never have a situation in which we can have an external partner that would subsidize us to do whatever we want to do. What we want to do, we have to do it on our own sources.
Well, when they subsidize what you want to do, of course, there are also things taken away from you about what they want to do with you. That is just a game that we all knew about when it comes to the Cold War, right? So before we go, we also want to ask you, Mr. Batista, I see you nodding your head, you know, over and over again what Mr. Ambassador was trying to illustrate. There has to be change, and there has to be a change about better economy, sustainable economy. That is the only way to sustain the governance of the Communist Party in Cuba. Mr. Batista, so about that, there has to be reform. So we're coming back to our full circle of discussion. The reform, though, would upset people, some small groups at least. So it's really about building the tension and solve the tension. From the tension itself to the solution themselves, where are we right now? Your judgment.
So I think we're in a crucial time right now. people who they disagree that they might disagree with the reforms that even Raul Castro has taken, and even Raul Castro, he has signaled that he had to negotiate with some member of the parties. People who are in disagreement with that, mostly they are older than the new members of the party, like Díaz-Canel and other members, Foreign Affairs Minister Bruno Díaz Rodríguez, Rodríguez Parrilla, I'm sorry. So again, we have to move forward as a country, and people, the average Cuban, they are asking for more reforms, for deeper reforms. And we have the entrepreneurs, for example, who are asking for more reforms to open the economy, to achieve a more sustainable life for the average Cuban.
All right. Also, Professor Jiang, the outside factor, how important is it for Cuba to come? As Mr. Ambassador already said it very clearly, that probably, or rather, Mr. Batista said it very clearly, the Trump administration wouldn't make that much difference in terms of their attitude toward the Castro administration or toward the latter administration, as long as it's the Communist Party. So, Mr. Jiang, what is going to be the outside factors' influence and impact on Cuba's next step?
Well, the most important external factor would be the so-called U.S. blockade against Cuba. Well, with this kind of severe sanction against Cuba, it is really very difficult for this Caribbean island to develop its economy. So let's hope that the U.S. will do away with these kind of 6 laws that put the sanctions against Cuba. That's more than half a century. So I hope that when the new leader comes to office, Trump and Díaz-Canel can have a meeting so that there should be a kind of a peaceful resolution. More process of normalization between the two countries.
It takes two to tango. If there is one side that has the hope, well, it really depends on whether the other side would also like to share that. We are running out of time for now. Jiang Xueshi, Luis Carlos Batista, and also Carlos Alzugari. Thank you so much for being with us. You're watching World Insight with me on CGTN.